Chosen one, let's get one thing straight from the start. You are not here by accident. You didn't stumble in, you rose in. You've walked through storms that would have swallowed others whole. And yet here you are, not broken, but building. Not bitter, but burning. You see, life didn't hand you a crown. It handed you fire. And instead of letting it consume you, you learned to dance in the heat. That's rare. That's sacred. That's power. Most people spend their whole lives trying to avoid pain. But you faced it, sat with it, let it teach you. And whether you know it or not, that pain became your initiation. You've been refined, not ruined. Set apart, not set back. So tonight, stand tall. Look around you. You are not alone. You're surrounded by others who carry that same sacred weight. The world may not understand it, but you do. This isn't just your comeback. This is your becoming. Welcome to the rise of the anointed ones, looking for purpose and peace. Hit subscribe and start the journey. What was once buried beneath polished grins and shallow gestures is now being unearthed, not with ceremony, but with certainty. This isn't about sentiment, it's about exposure. They didn't just strain your spirit, they toyed with it, like careless hands twisting delicate glass, unaware or unmoved by what shattered in the process. Cloaked in kindness, armed with practiced charm, they fractured without flinching. But you held steady, not with bitterness, but with restraint, like a sealed chamber storing thunder, waiting on divine timing. And now, that chamber has burst, not in chaos, but in clarity. The reckoning unfolding isn't vengeance, it's illumination. Those who once dismissed you now flinch at the echoes of a truth they thought was buried. What they hear isn't your voice, it's the reverberation of consequence. If any of them are listening now, they should know, you are not the storm, but the storm has arrived, and it did not come to bargain. There's a quiet line between misjudgment and malice, and they leapt over it. Not out of confusion, but for sport. What they did wasn't clumsy or misguided. It was calculated, even if unconsciously so. There's a deep fracture in the soul of someone who finds amusement in someone else's undoing. They didn't just witness your pain, they consumed it, mistaking your silence for weakness, your composure for consent. Their cruelty wasn't a reaction, it was a routine, a ritual. And while they marveled at the chaos they orchestrated, unaware of their own corruption, something far greater than their conscience was keeping score. Every smirk, every whisper manipulation, every smug dismissal, it all became part of a sacred dossier, unseen but not unfelt. What they thought was invisible was simply being preserved. They didn't realize they were carving their own path to collapse with every step they took against you. They believed your suffering was a win, but it was the prologue to their own undoing. Your tears were not wasted. They became something far more volatile. Each slight, each deception, became a match tossed into a growing reservoir of unseen consequence. And now that ignition has begun, not with fanfare, but with precision, make your impact eternal. Join now and be a light in someone's darkness. What they built on illusion is dissolving beneath them, and no facade can withstand it. The silence they mistook for defeat was actually a countdown. They mistook God's patience for absence. But delay is not denial, it's alignment. And now, they've reached the end of the rope they unknowingly knotted for themselves. This was never just between you and them. This was seen. And when what is holy steps in, there is no debate, only result. They believed silence was surrender, mistaking calm for defeat. But every silent ache, every unjust blow absorbed without retaliation was a coded message sent straight to the heavens, like signals on a divine frequency. Not once did you retaliate, not because you lacked the will, but because a higher law was already in session, one not governed by impulse or noise. While they mocked and maneuvered, a quiet archive was growing in realms they cannot access. Their slander wasn't erased, it was encoded into a ledger that never forgets. Your sorrow wasn't just a season, it became celestial proof. They thought they were winning, mistaking stillness for absence. But what they couldn't see was that judgment never rushes. It collects, it measures, and when the time comes, it arrives not as a whisper, but as a verdict. They underestimated the cost of injustice committed in confidence. Now, those costs are being called in. And no excuse, no performance, No reshaping of the past will cancel the reckoning they wrote with their own hands. The harm wasn't just emotional. It was a disruption of sacred alignment. They saw flesh but ignored the spirit. They interacted with you like a statue in a crowd, blind to the fact that they were violating something guarded. You were not simply surviving. You were carrying an assignment veiled in humility. And when they crossed boundaries, thinking they were correcting or advising, they unknowingly trespassed into territory governed by forces they can't manipulate. What they considered harmless moments became breaches in a contract they didn't even know existed. But heaven knew. And heaven watched. Not with haste, but with intention. Not with revenge, but with remembrance that if your heart overflows with divine love, now is the moment to let it shine. Click the super thank you button on YouTube and give $50 or more to help carry God's light to others. Your gift will bless not only your life, but countless others. You are part of His sacred plan. Your kindness may be the answer to someone's prayer. Share your blessings and honor His kingdom. May His grace guide you always. The energy they expelled trying to diminish you became the very weight, pulling them into exposure. Not because you returned the harm, but because you didn't. That restraint unlocked something ancient, something irreversible. While they played games cloaked in charm and logic, their own hands were setting traps beneath their future. And now, those traps have snapped shut, not by your doing, but by universal law. Sacred things, when mishandled, react, not with noise, but with consequence. And now that reaction is touching everything they once thought was secure. The disruption is not symbolic. It's structural. It's in their patterns, their progress, their peace. Because when harm meets sacred ground, response is guaranteed. Not instant, but inescapable. They cast shadows hoping you'd collapse beneath them. But instead, those same shadows have returned, louder and heavier, with no switch to shut them off. They didn't strike because of your actions. They reacted to what you unknowingly carried within. What they encountered wasn't a personality clash. It was a confrontation with something sacred that your life revealed. You represented everything they chose to suppress. Where they built walls, your presence opened windows. Where they masked the truth, your clarity made it harder to pretend. They couldn't look at you without being reminded of the version of themselves they abandoned. Rather than facing that uncomfortable reflection, they turned against the mirror. Their aggression wasn't random. It was a flare in a war they didn't understand. What they challenged wasn't flesh and bone, but a current of purpose flowing through you that their spirit couldn't ignore. You were not merely a person to them. You were a disruption, reminder, a signal they wished would stop ringing. But what they failed to grasp is that resistance against purpose is resistance against the source of that purpose. Their battle lines weren't drawn against you, but against what animated you. The backlash they now face didn't originate from your hands. It came from the very order they transgressed. Their intent was to diminish you, but their hostility became the evidence that activated your elevation. They mistook your resilience for weakness and overlooked the reality that your strength was borrowed from a place far beyond comprehension. While they strategized in shadows, a higher force was already adjusting the stage. You did not ask to be a symbol. Yet by existing in alignment, you became one. And in trying to silence your presence, they declared opposition to what sent you. That's where they miscalculated. The moment they tried to disrupt what they didn't plant, they stepped into a consequence they never saw coming. Not because you retaliated, but because the one who commissioned you never abandons a mission left unfinished. Make your impact eternal. Join now and be a light in someone's darkness. They mistook a mirror for a doormat. Where they expected to find someone to manipulate, they encountered a measure of who they truly were. They dismissed what was meant to reveal them. Every moment they shrugged off kindness or exploited gentleness. They were displaying a hidden inventory of their soul, not to you, but to what orchestrated your crossing paths. You weren't a fixture in their life. You were a signal flare. Their treatment of you wasn't graded by your reaction, but by the integrity they chose, or lacked, when they thought no consequence would follow. The stillness you held wasn't silence. It was a record. The warmth you offered wasn't passivity. It was a scale. And while they operated as if they held the script, what they didn't know was that the story wasn't centered on them at all. You were the hinge, not the scenery. Their pride read you as ordinary, when you were sent to weigh the extraordinary. In mistaking presence for passivity, they exposed their own alignment. What happened next was never about your defense. It was about the imbalance they created in a space they misunderstood. The consequence wasn't personal, it was systemic. Because when character is tested through encounters and fails in secrecy, the correction comes openly, not as vengeance, but as a verdict. They didn't set your path ablaze. They ignited the foundation beneath their own plans. Every sharp word, every manipulative move, every attempt to cloud your clarity wasn't a disruption to your purpose, but a detour to their own. What they sowed wasn't sabotage, it was echo. Their intent circled back, not as poetic justice, but as law in motion. As they layered falsehoods and cloaked intentions with charm, they unwittingly laid a fragile blueprint over unstable ground. And now the vibrations of what they triggered are shifting everything they built, not because of your resistance, but because of the weight of what they denied. When envy builds a structure, erosion follows. The timeline they thought they interrupted wasn't yours, it was theirs. You were shaped, not shattered, but they tethered themselves to a sequence that now unravels without your touch. It was never your retaliation that lit the fuse. It was the injustice itself that became the fuel. And while they cling to stories, reality does not bend to volume. It honors alignment. Now the collapse isn't chaos, it's a cleansing. The cracks were there all along. Your presence only made them visible. What falls now is not punishment. It is purification that if your heart overflows with divine love, now is the moment to let it shine. Click the super thank you button on YouTube and give $50 or more to help carry God's light to others. Your gift will bless not only your life, but countless others. You are part of His sacred plan. Your kindness may be the answer to someone's prayer. Share your blessings and honor His kingdom. May His grace guide you always. What they mistook as your breaking point was actually the ignition of a reality they couldn't foresee. As they observed your quiet retreat, they assumed victory, unaware that something ancient and powerful was being stirred beyond their grasp. They misread your silence as surrender, your stillness as defeat. But what passed through you in those moments wasn't weakness, it was transmission. Every ache held language they could never decode, dispatching signals beyond the surface, bypassing noise, and reaching depths where truth cannot be silenced. What looked like helplessness was the genesis of a response not born of anger, but of unshakable authority. What they saw as collapse was convergence. While they ridiculed what they could not interpret, a reckoning was accumulating strength, not with noise, but with certainty. They failed to recognize the difference between spectacle and power. This wasn't about retaliation. This was about gravity, an unseen pull aligning justice with timing. The fallout they mocked was actually alignment in motion. And now, without warning, what they denied has arrived. Not gentle, not symbolic, but tectonic. A shift that doesn't negotiate or explain itself, not summoned by vengeance, but by a demand for restoration that had been accumulating in silence. They underestimated the quiet, and in doing so, awakened what cannot be silenced. They weren't unaware. They weren't misguided. The signs weren't subtle. They simply chose not to change. Warnings echoed around them in unfamiliar voices, delays that weren't random, unrest they couldn't shake. But instead of slowing down, they increased speed. Instead of asking why, they doubled their steps in defiance. This wasn't ignorance. It was determination wrapped in pride. Every gentle delay they encountered was a mirror, every strange dream a whisper. But they shoved past all of it. They saw leniency and mistook it for approval. They were never forced into darkness. They carved that path with open eyes. Mercy gave them room. They used it to construct more ruin. What now collapses around them is not a surprise. It is an echo of every moment they were given a change and refused. This isn't an accident. It's the result of a pattern uninterrupted by humility. They didn't just cross the line, they erased it. Not by mistake, but by choice. The fallout is not fueled by rage, but by principle. What they face now is not punishment. It's the natural conclusion of defiance, sustained too long. And once the door closes on that kind of rebellion, it doesn't creak or hesitate. It seals. There are people born with invisible frameworks others can't perceive. Structures that react not with sound but with sequence. What they overlooked was that certain souls carry embedded systems, not triggered by rage, but by alignment. Some connections are not casual intersections, they're contracts. And when those agreements are dishonored repeatedly, a silent mechanism initiates. There isn't a bell or a flash, but the shift begins regardless. It's not about retaliation. It's about capacity. There's a threshold inside those designed with higher assignments, and once it's breached, the process does not rewind. It doesn't require words or confrontation. It unfolds quietly, precisely. They assumed they had time. They believed they could keep dipping into grace, as if it were a bottomless well. What they didn't realize is that mercy wears a timer when it's tied to divine design. And once the final grain of allowance falls, recalibration begins. Structures start to tremble, not as punishment, but as reordering. The roles shift, not because someone walked away, but because their access expired. They thought they were in control, but were seated on borrowed ground that was always scheduled to collapse if mistreated. Now the unraveling is subtle but constant. Closed doors, lost platforms, fading favor. And they don't know when it started, but the one they tried to overpower felt the shift the moment the silence turned into sanction. The unraveling isn't loud, but it is complete. And now, the recalibration won't stop until balance is fully restored. Those who once treated your sorrow like a spectacle will soon face their own mirrors. The same voices that ridiculed your emotion, reduced your pain to theatrics, and turned your name into whispered entertainment are about to be met with a silence that speaks louder than any plea. They didn't just doubt your strength, they disrespected your purpose. And now that the tides have turned and unseen forces are responding, they'll remember everything they said with trembling clarity. The cycle they laughed at is now circling them, and the confusion they once caused is taking root in their own circles. Loss won't knock. It will slip in unnoticed, through doors they forgot they left open. They will try to rationalize the breakdowns, call it coincidence, bad timing, or misfortune. But under the noise, they'll know. The one they dismissed carried more than emotion, they carried connection. A rare link they discarded too easily. And when the weight of their own decisions corners them, they'll search for the steadiness they once ignored. They'll reach for the same prayers they rolled their eyes at. But this time, the door won't budge. Not because of resentment, but because the chapter has closed. Access was granted once as a form of mercy, but now the role has shifted. What they called excessive, they now see was exceptional. What they joked about, they now need. But cycles don't rewind for comfort. Sometimes closure is silence, and distance is divine. What they took for granted is gone. Not vanished, but elevated beyond reach. They didn't lose a person. They lost a lifeline disguised as one. There are some who crave influence not to uplift, but to dominate, needing control over others to feel sovereign within themselves. Their strategy was never random, it was meticulous, undermining your clarity, sowing hesitation in your convictions, all crafted to shape a version of you that would orbit around their ego. Not because they wanted closeness, but because they wanted dominion disguised as connection. Their tactics weren't rooted in passion, but in possession. Slowly, they diluted your identity to amplify their own echo. Praise was doled out only when it fed their image. Criticism came cloaked as concern, but hit like commands. It was never about support. It was about submission. Make your impact eternal. Join now and be a light in someone's darkness. They craved to be the compass you looked to, the judge you feared, the approval you couldn't function without. And when you began reclaiming your inner authority, they didn't withdraw, they escalated. Your awakening threatened the empire they built on your uncertainty. They played the role of guide, healer, savior, but only after wounding you first. Every silence from them was strategic. Every kind word came with a leash. What they wanted wasn't love, it was allegiance. And they wrapped it in charm, so no one would see the strings. But those strings have begun to snap. Not through confrontation, but through revelation. The illusions are fraying in plain sight. Those who once applauded them are beginning to notice the distortion behind the presentation. It is not slander doing the damage, it's divine dismantling. What once looked like confidence now reeks of performance. The pedestal they forced their way onto is collapsing under its own deception. They thought they had secured loyalty, What they activated was exposure. Because when anyone tries to take the place of what is sacred in someone's life, they don't just overstep, they self-destruct. If your heart overflows with divine love, now is the moment to let it shine. Click the super thank you button on YouTube and give $50 or more to help carry God's light to others. Your gift will bless not only your life, but countless others. You are part of His sacred plan. Your kindness may be the answer to someone's prayer. Share your blessings and honor His kingdom. May His grace guide you always. What's striking now is not the retaliation they expected, but the silence they can't comprehend. No retaliation, no exposure, no confrontation, just survival that rattles every lie they built. They didn't prepare for that. The one they tried to spiritually silence didn't throw accusations or seek sympathy. They endured, and that endurance set something irreversible in motion. Now the ground beneath them is shifting, and they don't know who to blame. So they point at the one they couldn't control. They cry sabotage, spin tales, weaponize innocence. But behind the chaos, something far greater is responding, and it's not wrath. It's balance. This fallout didn't originate in vengeance, but in the unshakable laws they triggered themselves. Every manipulative word, every smear, every tactic soaked in self-righteousness was recorded beyond their understanding. And when the line was crossed one too many times, it wasn't emotion that moved, it was consequence. Not sudden, not loud, but absolute. And now, as their constructs fall apart, as their influence dissolves and their narratives collapse, they'll reach for reasons that don't exist. This isn't a result of curses or karma. It's divine restoration in motion. The silence they laughed at now echoes with meaning. The one they pushed aside wasn't weak, they were consecrated. The unraveling they face wasn't lit by offense. It was drawn in by arrogance. What's falling isn't a relationship or reputation. It's a system built on stolen ground. And no amount of feigned remorse can delay what has already begun. What they mocked was never a threat. It was a mirror. And now that mirror no longer reflects them. It reveals them. Some don't just aim to hurt, they aim to erase. They convinced themselves that their games had succeeded, that the silence they left behind was victory, and that your exit meant extinction. But what they didn't account for was transformation that unfolds in the absence of applause. You weren't undone. You were being restructured beneath the surface. Their sabotage didn't bury you. It built a hidden launch site. The isolation they forced on you didn't diminish your essence. It recalibrated your direction. Every false narrative they crafted became scaffolding for your expansion. Every moment of anguish was translated into blueprints for a greater design. And while they celebrated what they believed was your collapse, something irreversible began to shift. What they thought was the finale was merely a silent ignition. You weren't left behind. You were being propelled into alignment with a destiny that couldn't fit within their limits. While they laughed at your disappearance, something unseen began to grow with force. The illusion of your defeat was their greatest miscalculation. Make your impact eternal. Join now and be a light in someone's darkness. The very tactics they used to fracture you became the framework of your evolution. Not because you fought back, but because you outlasted the storm without becoming it. The sabotage wasn't a tomb, it was a threshold. And now, without announcement or validation, your steps are unlocking spaces they swore you'd never enter. The irony burns in their confusion as they watch the trajectory they tried to interrupt become unstoppable. You did not retaliate. You outgrew. You didn't defend your name. You let evidence speak. Their sabotage only amplified the momentum of your unfolding. And now, the very ones who engineered your exile are spectators of a momentum they can't replicate or reverse. The harm they thought was permanent has become irrelevant. Not because it didn't matter, but because it couldn't stop what was written. You weren't a casualty of cruelty. You were the beginning of something their control could never cage. While they gather pieces of their illusions, you are walking in unshakable clarity. This isn't triumph soaked in vengeance. It's justice clothed in dignity. No words needed. No explanations owed. What they tried to destroy has risen without permission and beyond their reach. Make your impact eternal. Join now and be a light in someone's darkness. They misread your quiet as closure, but it was incubation. And now, as their stories unravel, Yours is taking shape in undeniable brilliance. You weren't discarded. You were designated. And that appointment is now on full display. Not with noise, but with power they never saw coming.